Third Reich. In just over a decade, the Nazis rose from being a tiny group of committed racists to become a mass movement able to seize absolute power. They used every possible means to gain control of Germany, from contesting elections legally, through intimidation and thuggery, to bribery, corruption, and murder. Under their Führer Adolf Hitler, the Nazis were to lead the German people into the costliest war in history, a war which would see ordinary Germans committing the most gruesome crimes ever recorded. With hindsight, the nature of the Nazi movement was obvious from the start, but few in those early days took Hitler seriously, and by the time they did, it was too late. The roots of the Third Reich can be traced to Germany's defeat in the Great War. Many soldiers returning from the front wrongly believed that Germany's imperial forces had not been defeated in the field, even though the last 4 months of the war had in fact been a continuous series of victories for the Allies. On top of that, the Allied blockade had brought Germany's economy to the brink of ruin and her population to the edge of starvation. This situation seemed ripe for revolution. In this poisonous atmosphere, there arose many political movements which seemed to offer the Germans a way out of their despair. These movements ranged across the political spectrum. Some followed the Soviet model, while others were extreme nationalists. But only one movement was to succeed: National Socialism. The rise of National Socialism can be traced to one man, Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born at Braunau am Inn in Austria in 1889, to Alois Heidler, an Austrian customs official. He was an indolent child who turned into a self-centered young man. From his late teens, he scratched a living as an artist in Vienna and later in Munich. When war broke out in Europe, Hitler immediately joined the Bavarian army. He was a good soldier, decorated for bravery, but never rose above the rank of corporal. Germany's defeat hit soldiers like Hitler hard. Confused and bitter, he returned to Munich searching for reasons to explain that defeat. He and his comrades believed that they, the frontline troops, had been stabbed in the back by traitors back home in Germany. They blamed Social Democrats, pacifists, liberals, and others. But to Hitler and those who shared his opinions, the real villains were the Bolsheviks and the Jews. They were seen as one and the same, since many of the revolutionary groups in the German army and navy late in 1918 were led by Jewish agitators. After the Great War, Hitler was employed by the German army as a spy. His job was to report on right-wing nationalist groups in Munich. In the process, he found a ready audience for his own extreme nationalist political views. Among the small groups he spied on was the political workers' circle. Renamed the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or German Workers' Party, it held its first meeting in January 1919. Hitler joined the party later that year. He quickly took control of what had been little more than a debating society and turned it into the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. Bavaria in the years after World War I was a political ferment. The threat of revolution from the right or left wings was ever present. In November 1923, the Nazis mounted a premature attempt to seize power in Munich, the Beer Hall Putsch. It began when Hitler and a small group of Nazis took control of a political meeting in the Bürgerbrau Keller on November the 8th. The putsch came to an abrupt end the following day, when police used force to halt a Nazi party march on the center of government. 16 Nazis were killed by gunfire. Several prominent Nazis were wounded, among them Hitler and another leading Nazi party member, World War I fighter ace Hermann Göring. Hitler went into hiding, but was later arrested, tried and imprisoned. The Nazi party was declared illegal and went into decline. The blood-stained swastika banner carried during the putsch later became known as the Blutfahne, or Blood Banner, and became one of the holiest relics of the Nazi movement. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment in Landsberg prison, but thanks to a sympathetic judge, he only served 8 months there. While in prison, Hitler began to write Mein Kampf, the book which set out his political philosophy. On his release from Landsberg in December 1924, he immediately set about rebuilding the moribund Nazi Party. The Nazi Party could not have come to power without several key organizations which forcefully backed up its political program. Prominent in the party's early rise were the brown-shirted stormtroopers of the Sturmabteilung, or Assault Detachment, which was commonly known by its initials as the SA. The origins of the SA date back to 1921. Its task was to protect Nazi party meetings, disrupt the meetings of opposing parties, and to march and look impressive at rallies. The members of the Sturmabteilung were ready and willing to trade hard knocks with the Nazis' political opponents. With the failure of the 1923 putsch, the SA was declared illegal. The SA was reformed in February 1925, though it was much smaller and its members were forbidden to bear arms. Now, for the first time, the SA adopted the distinctive brown uniform that earned its members the nickname Brown Shirts. 1925 also saw the founding of another Nazi organization. There had been small protection squads within the larger SA since 1923. But in 1925, these became the Schutzstaffel, or SS. The early days of the SS saw its strength rise to 400 in 1930. In this year, it became an independent force within the SA, and its members adopted the SS trademark, an all-black uniform. At the head of the SS was a seemingly mild-mannered man, Heinrich Himmler. But the appearance was deceptive. The bespectacled Himmler was in fact a right-wing fanatic who had played a small part in the abortive putsch of 1923. In a decade, he oversaw the meteoric rise of the SS, from being a small bodyguard formation into an immensely wealthy, immensely powerful state within a state. Appointed Reichsführer of the SS in 1929, Himmler became one of the most feared men in the Third Reich, gaining control of the police and the security forces in 1933. Hitler was banned from political activity, so it was not until July 1926 that he presided over the next major Nazi gathering. Held at Weimar, this was the first rally to be called a Parteitag, or Party Day. It began on July the 3rd and ended at noon the following day, and the meeting marked the emergence of Dr. Joseph Goebbels as a major personality within the Nazi Party. Born into a devoutly Catholic Rhineland family, Goebbels became the Nazi Party's intellectual and propaganda expert. When World War I broke out, the army rejected him because of his dwarfish height and a foot crippled in childhood. Originally an opponent of Hitler, he became a follower of the Führer in 1926, when he was made Gauleiter of Berlin. He entered the German parliament, the Reichstag, in 1928. A student of American journalism and advertising techniques, he used these to great effect in the run-up to power in 1933. He was made Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Another prominent Nazi was Rudolf Hess. Born in Egypt, Hess served in the same regiment as Hitler during World War I, before transferring to the Air Force. He became Hitler's secretary in 1920 and shared his imprisonment in Landsberg. While there, he took down Hitler's dictation of Mein Kampf. Hess was appointed Hitler's deputy in 1932 and played a key role in affairs of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. At this time, Hess was second only in power to Hermann Göring, who was himself Hitler's designated successor. Göring was a flamboyant figure of considerable charm. During World War I, he served as a fighter pilot, scoring 22 kills and winning the coveted Pour le Mérite. Göring joined the new Nazi Party in 1923 and was made commander of the SA. Wounded in the beer hall putsch, he became the most important member of the party leadership after the Führer. By August 1927, there were 30,000 men in the SA, and by 1929, the figure had doubled. Traditional army drill and military bands had been added to SA formations, giving a parade ground bravura and military flair to the organization. For the first time, the streets of Germany saw the raised arms salute and the chants of Heil Hitler and Sieg Heil during massed parades by the SA. The Great World Depression of the late 1920s and early 1930s saw a renewed interest in the Nazi Party. Those who joined the party were the unemployed and the disaffected. But to gain political power, the Nazis needed to win the votes of the middle classes. This was achieved with promises of jobs and economic security set against the background of rampant hyperinflation, poverty, and massive unemployment. The first fruits of this policy came in 1929, when the party won its first seats in local elections. The Nuremberg Party rally in August that year was the first truly spectacular event of its type. More than 2,000 delegates assembled to hear speeches from Hitler, Goebbels, and Gauleiter of Nuremberg, Julius Streicher. There were athletes with burning torches, the formation of human swastikas, and dazzling fireworks. In 1930, the party consolidated its power by gaining more than 100 seats in the Reichstag. In particular, the Nazis had benefited from strong support among the middle classes and the Protestant North, who had been hard hit by the Depression. On the 5th of January 1931, Ernst Röhm was appointed SA Chief of Staff and immediately began a program of expansion. Röhm was a much-decorated World War I officer who had been influential during the early days of the party, but who had spent several years in exile as a military advisor in Bolivia. A scar-faced pederast, Röhm was an organizer of genius. He turned the SA into a power within the party and within the state. In October 1931, in a token mobilization, the Nazis were able to concentrate 104,000 uniformed SA men in the town of Brunswick. This display of strength so startled the Weimar authorities that in December they imposed a ban on the wearing of all political uniforms. This proscription had little effect, since the Nazis adopted the civilian uniform of a white shirt and black tie, which effectively distinguished them on the streets. By March 1932, the SA was back in uniform, and its strength stood at 400,000. It was a potent political tool, which Hitler was to use to great effect as he embarked on the final year of his road to power in March 1933. But the operational leadership of the SA had its own agenda. It wanted a true National Socialist revolution, something at odds with Hitler's vision and personal ambitions. It would become a problem which would have to be dealt with. During 1932, the Nazis for the first time began to make overtures to German industrialists and financiers. These would provide funding for the expansion of the party and support within the upper echelons of society, which the Nazis openly lacked. Within a year, leading German industrialists, led by Gustav Krupp, would be pledging millions of marks to the National Socialists. In May 1932, Hitler stood against Field Marshal Hindenburg in the presidential election. Although defeated, he gained about a third of the vote. Hindenburg dismissed the government that month and appointed career politician Franz von Papen as Chancellor. In June, von Papen lifted the ban on the SA, dissolved the Reichstag, and scheduled elections for July. Once unleashed, the SA and the Communists clashed head-on. In the first 3 weeks of June, 461 major street battles were fought in Prussia alone, resulting in 82 fatalities. There was even a brawl inside the Prussian Parliament building, with Nazi deputies forcibly ejecting the Communists. The political infighting continued over the summer, and von Papen was forced to call another election in November. The two bitterly fought elections of 1932 made the Nazis the largest party in the Reichstag, but without an overall majority. A coalition of right-wing interests invited the Nazis into government, but Hitler would only accept if he was made Chancellor. Believing they could control the Nazi leader, the politicians accepted. And on the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Hitler had gained his foothold on power, and he set about making himself supreme. On February the 27th, fire broke out at the Reichstag. Hitler blamed communist revolutionaries and used this as a pretext to suspend all civil liberties in Germany. By the end of March, the so-called Enabling Act had given him dictatorial powers. But even before this, the Nazis had already begun to deal with their enemies. Of Hitler's accession to power, squads of SA and SS men were seizing political opponents off the streets and imprisoning them in newly established concentration camps without due process of law. Among those opponents were many representatives of organized labor. The trades unions had supported the Nazis as a means of ensuring their own survival under a Nazi regime. However, during the May Day celebrations in 1933, whilst most workers were celebrating, SA's stormtroopers assaulted union offices all over Germany, seizing property and assets on behalf of the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the Nazi labor organization. The next day, senior trade union officials were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps. Life here was harsh and brutal. The idea was to dissuade the inmates from opposing the Nazi regime. The most stubborn opponents were simply killed, their unexplained disappearance being the most effective method of persuasion, pour encourager les autres. Over the next 6 years, the first two camps at Oranienburg and Dachau were joined by 6 others. With the coming of war, however, the camp system expanded to titanic proportions. By 1945, there were 1,100 such camps scattered throughout occupied Europe. In addition to declaring war on communism, the Nazis turned their attentions to seditious literature and non-German thought. In May 1933, pro-Nazi students in university towns, inspired by propaganda minister Goebbels, burned any books disapproved of by the Nazis. These included works by leading Jewish, socialist and liberal intellectuals.
Der Durchbruch der deutschen Revolution hat auf dem deutschen Weg wieder die Gasse freigemacht. Der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches,
To celebrate Hitler's assumption of power, the rally in 1933 was called the Congress of Victory. Numbers attending had increased beyond all measure. The logistic effort to house and feed 500,000 Nazis required the requisitioning of churches, factories and public buildings, as well as assembling tented villages with field kitchens. The rallies provided a perfect example of Hitler's ability to manipulate huge numbers of people. A master of mass psychology, he used his mesmeric oratory to whip the crowd into a frenzy of devotion.
Dieses Volk wollen wir ringen und wollen wir kämpfen und niemals erlahmen und niemals ermüden und niemals verzagen und niemals verzweifeln.
Prominent in the crowds were the young and impressionable. Nazi propaganda made great play of the Führer's love of children, but their main importance to the party was to provide the future membership of the NSDAP. Originally known as the Youth League of the NSDAP, the Hitler Jugend or Hitler Youth had been formed in 1926. Under the leadership of Balthar von Schirach, its numbers grew along with the party. In 1933, the Hitler Youth became a state agency, absorbing all other youth movements in Germany, and numbers rocketed. Membership was made compulsory for all German boys and girls in April 1939. At its height, the movement numbered more than 3.5 million, aged from 10 to 18. In spite of the triumphs of 1933, Hitler's position was not secure. Not the least of the thorns in his side was the SA, by now nearly 4 million strong. The SA had upset 3 groups which Hitler needed. Its violent radicalism offended the Führer's conservative supporters. Rome's desire to disband the army and absorb it into the SA had offended the generals, and his increasing personal power on the streets worried Nazi rivals like Goering, Goebbels and Himmler. Hitler decided to resolve his differences by eliminating the SA's leadership. On the night of the 30th of June 1934, Hitler unleashed the SS and Gestapo during what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. They arrested or murdered SA leaders all over Germany. Röhm and his senior commanders were taken while carousing at a Bavarian lake resort. Röhm was shot the next day. Barely 2 months later, the night of the murders had faded into oblivion as the Nazi Party gathered at Nuremberg for its annual rally. Former actress-turned-director Leni Riefenstahl was to record the occasion for posterity, and the film which emerged, Triumph of the Will, is probably the most powerful piece of propaganda ever created. It turned Hitler into a Wagnerian hero, and at the same time glorified the Nazi Party as the hope for Germany's future. Riefenstahl deployed 30 cameramen and had special trackways and elevators built to produce dramatic shots of the rally. The memorable images included massive torchlight processions, the unfurling of 21,000 flags, and the sight of 50,000 men of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the German labor service, standing with their shovels glittering in the sun.
Wir sind bereit und fahren Deutschland in die neue Zeit. Deutschland, wie einst bei Dänemark.
Triumph of the Will won many international film awards. The film received a National State Prize, the Gold Medal at the Venice Film Festival, and a Grand Prix of the French government at the Paris Film Festival. Riefenstahl's success in presenting such a positive image of the Nazi Party led to her admission to the inner circle of the Führer.
Ihr repräsentiert eine große Idee.
The positive imagery of triumph of the will hid a much darker truth, the Nazi oppression of the Jewish people. A year after the film, Hitler took the opportunity at the 1935 rally to present the Nuremberg laws on race and citizenship. Directed primarily at Jews, they made clear to the rest of the world the true character of the new German government.
Vollzieht sich mit einer schlagartigen Wucht, aber auch mit einer imponierenden Manneszucht und Disziplin. Heil! Heil! Heil!
Jews had already been targeted. Immediately on coming to power in 1933, the Nazis enacted anti-Jewish legislation which confiscated property and deprived Jews of their civil rights. But the Nuremberg laws went even further and deprived the Jews of what remained of their rights and dignity. Anti-Semitic activity continued with party-coordinated attacks on Jewish synagogues, shops and homes all over the Reich. These attacks came to a climax 3 years later with the nationwide pogrom known as Kristallnacht. Having dealt with most internal opposition, the Nazis turned their attention beyond their borders. Hitler had never concealed his determination to achieve mastery of Europe, and to do so by force of arms if necessary. But in order to achieve his aims, the German military machine had to be rebuilt. That was in clear contravention of the terms dictated to Germany by the Allied powers at Versailles in 1919. In August 1934, President von Hindenburg died. Hitler proclaimed himself Chancellor and Führer of the German Reich. Almost immediately, he ordered the creation of a German air force, which had been forbidden to Germany by the Versailles Treaty. The first overt sign that Germany had repudiated its treaty commitments came on March the 10th, 1935, when Hermann Göring announced the existence of the Luftwaffe. Training of military pilots began immediately, with the establishment of gliding and sports flying clubs all over Germany. Manufacturers were commissioned to design airliners and transports, which were in fact thinly disguised bombers. At the time of Göring's announcement, the Luftwaffe already had more than 1,800 aircraft and 20,000 personnel. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the German army had been limited to a strength of 100,000 men. Immediately on assuming power, Hitler had assured the generals that one of his first tasks would be to build up the armed forces. In October 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference. Early the following year, the army was instructed to treble its strength to 300,000 by the end of October, and to do so in secret. In March 1936, Hitler came out into the open. He announced the repudiation of the Treaty of Versailles and the reintroduction of conscription. The peacetime German army would consist of 36 divisions organized into 12 corps, a strength of around 500,000 men. Armaments for this vastly expanded army would be provided by concerns like Krupp, which had been carrying out clandestine research and development programs since the 1920s. Krupp and other armaments firms had also been preparing modern armour and artillery designs since 1933. France and the League of Nations protested, but did little else. To counter criticism, Hitler offered to limit German naval expansion. The British accepted. But Germany was already building up its fleet. 4 pocket battleships, very heavily armed cruisers designed for commerce raiding, were already being built. Under the terms of an Anglo-German naval agreement of June 1935, the Kriegsmarine would be limited to 35% of the total British tonnage. However, the Germans were already building 2 26,000-ton battlecruisers in contravention of the agreement. Plans were also being drawn up to construct a fleet of the world's largest battleships by the early 1940s. More significant, the British would allow Germany to match the Royal Navy's submarine tonnage. This was a curious concession from a country which had been on the receiving end of unrestricted U-boat warfare in 1917 and 1918. Hitler's new fleets, divisions and squadrons would need weapons. These had to come from the industrial heartland of the Saar and the Rhineland, the areas, until recently, occupied by troops of the Allied powers of 1918. Both regions remained demilitarized and were still denied by treaty to German control. In January 1935, Hitler regained the Saar and its precious coal mines by the simple expedient of holding a plebiscite, which naturally he won. This enabled him to present the resumption of German control as a fait accompli to a world uninterested and, as yet, unsuspicious of his motives. But if the Saar was an important region, the Rhineland was absolutely vital to Hitler's plans. This was the very powerhouse of German industry, containing the majority of its steelworks and heavy manufacturing industry. But to seize control of the Rhineland was a gamble. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland. Hitler waited with some trepidation for British and French reaction. However, the Allies of 1918 rationalized both Hitler's aggression and their own inaction with such evasions of responsibility as, he is, after all, only walking into his own backyard. The increased industrial capacity enabled the Nazis to set a massive program of economic expansion in motion. Hitler's plan for national self-sufficiency in areas like engineering and the chemical industry was devised in the summer of 1936. Speaking of the project, Hitler said, "The success of this plan is merely a question of our energy and determination. National Socialists have never recognized the word impossible." One key element in the economic rebirth of Germany was the system of autobahns. Europe's first multiple-lane highways were seen as one of Nazi Germany's greatest pre-war achievements, even though they had been planned under the Weimar Republic. Hitler's government was quick to see the political and military value of a modern road network and immediately set out to build 11,000 kilometers of highway. No fewer than 30,000 men were committed to the task. Hitler's ambition was the main cause of the world conflict. But some blame must also be laid upon the leaders of the other great European powers for their lack of will and short-sightedness in appeasing the Führer. Hitler now waged a diplomatic offensive to convince the world that he had no further territorial ambitions. Joachim Ribbentrop, his ambassador to London, played an important part in this process.
This plan for the consolidation of Europe is proposed by 99% of Germany. That is, the entire German nation. A nation which once and for all has restored its sovereignty and which will never allow this sovereignty to be discussed again, but also a nation which wants nothing but freedom, equality, and peace. Germany is convinced that also the British people, as well as the French people, want this new peace in Europe, based on a spirit of conciliation among equal sovereign powers.
But while Hitler and his diplomats were preaching peace, the Wehrmacht was preparing for war.
Darüber gibt uns ein Unterlass. Der Welt unterstelle ich dich nicht. Ich kann mich nicht verwechseln. Hier unterwerfe mich, richte du mich, die du es nicht hättest.
2 months after the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the Spanish Civil War broke out. It was quickly evident that there were political sympathies between the rebel leader General Franco and the two dictators Mussolini and Hitler. These sympathies were quickly cemented by material help in the form of German weapons, advice, and personnel to Franco's nationalists. The Spanish War was to prove an ideal theatre in which to test the German armed forces' latest weapons, as well as to experiment with new military techniques and to train young officers in their use. France and Britain began reluctantly to stir themselves into action. An extension of France's main defences against possible German aggression, the Maginot Line, was agreed and construction began. Britain passed an air raid precaution bill through Parliament. However, any more rigorous preparation for war by the British was put on hold when Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister. Chamberlain was a man whose whole character and ambition were devoted to securing a place in history as a peacemaker. Having successfully extended the borders of the Reich westwards, Hitler now turned his attention to the east. To Hitler, Czechoslovakia was an anomaly. In his opinion, the Czech state had been carved out of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire by ignorant Americans and their democratic European lackeys. Therefore, it must cease to exist and become instead a part of the German Reich. The fact that it had never been part of a German state was beside the point. But first, there was Austria. On the 12th of March 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. The Austrian-born Führer had pressed for such a union for many years. The ground had been carefully prepared by the Nazi propaganda department with the help of an indigenous Austrian Nazi party formed and nurtured during the preceding months. Nicknamed the Blumenkrieger or Flower War, the Anschluss was engineered by Nazis within the government of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. He was replaced in a bloodless coup by the Austrian Nazi leader Arthur Seyss-Inquart. At his invitation, the German army occupied the country before any opposition could be mounted. The Anschluss was nominally a union of two sovereign states, but in reality it was more of an invasion and annexation by the Germans. However, it did have the support of a significant part of the Austrian population who sympathized with Nazi ideals. Following the Anschluss, Austria was incorporated into Greater Germany and renamed Ostmark. Following the success of the Anschluss, Hitler felt sure that the Czechs would realize the benefits of Nazi rule. At the very least, they would accept its inevitability and follow Austria's example. But both the leaders and people of Czechoslovakia were more inclined by their Bohemian blood towards independence than were the Germanically inclined Austrians. However, the thorn in the side of this argument was a strategically important part of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. Bordering Germany, the Sudetenland not only had a significant German-speaking population, but also contained much of the Czechs' defences and a great part of their industry. To Hitler's fury, the Czech government objected strongly to his proposals that the Sudetenland be handed over to Germany. In February 1938, Hitler assumed supreme military command of all Germany's forces. Disregarding any vague promises he may have made to the British the previous November, the Führer announced in a secret directive on the 30th of May his irrevocable decision to destroy Czechoslovakia. Hitler mobilized what had now become his Wehrmacht. In the midst of this international activity, the final and greatest party rally was held at Nuremberg. Lasting from September the 5th to the 12th, each day was dedicated to a separate theme. These included politics, youth, stormtroopers, and finally, the armed forces. The rally incorporated all the accumulated experiences of past years with parades, banners, reviews, speeches, torchlight processions, and fireworks. Over 1 million people attended, and hundreds of reporters from all over the world covered the event. It seemed like a triumph, but was in reality the requiem for the Reich. This would be the last party rally. By the time the next great celebration was due, Germany would be at war. Hitler's predictions of Allied non-reaction to his proposals proved correct. On the 15th of September, Chamberlain flew to Germany to try personally to persuade the Führer not to carry out his threats against the Czechs. In order to avert further crisis in Europe, both Chamberlain and the French Premier Daladier were persuaded to accept the German view. "Herr Hitler is a gentleman," Chamberlain announced upon his return to London. On the 22nd of September, Chamberlain returned to Germany for further talks with Hitler. 8 days later in Munich, he joined Daladier, Mussolini and Hitler to agree the transfer of the Sudetenland to the Reich. This was on condition that there would be no further expansion of German territory. Chamberlain then returned to England, waving the signed agreement and declaring, "I believe it is peace for our time." As a result of the Munich Agreement, the Wehrmacht moved into the Sudetenland unopposed. By the end of 1938, German engineers were dismantling Czech defences in the Sudetenland and transferring them westwards. Where the lion fed, there followed the jackals. Hungary annexed southern Slovakia, while Poland grabbed Teschen. Despite their Prime Minister's assurances, British volunteers were flocking to join the territorial army. As war clouds loomed, trenches were dug in London's parks and civilians built air raid shelters in their gardens. 1939 brought the crisis in Europe to a head. It opened with the defeat of the Spanish loyalist government and the almost immediate recognition of Franco as the new Spanish ruler by Chamberlain's government. By mid-March, the British Prime Minister was facing an even more bitter reality. Ignoring the Munich Agreement, German troops pushed forward from the Sudetenland, first to Prague and then on to occupy the whole of Bohemia and Moravia. Before leaving Berlin to make another triumphant entry, this time into Prague, Hitler announced that Czechoslovakia has ceased to exist. Chamberlain ruefully complained that the Führer had broken his word. It became obvious that Hitler now intended Poland as his next victim. There followed further diplomatic activity as Britain and France tried to form some cohesive alliance against the forces of fascist dictatorship. Offers from Russia to join were rejected. Conscription for men aged 20 to 21 was introduced in Britain. Throughout May, the diplomatic charade continued. Germany and Italy triumphantly announced the Pact of Steel. In August, at the prompting of Winston Churchill, a mission was sent to Moscow to explore the possibility of a military alliance. The Soviet Union was the only country able to field an army large enough to oppose the Wehrmacht. The mission was still there when the existence of a new non-aggression pact between Russia and Germany was revealed to an astonished world. It was a pact with secret clauses which were to become all too obvious only too soon. In response, Chamberlain announced Britain's guarantee of Poland's independence. On the 31st of August, Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. The optimistic Allied policy of appeasement had failed. Europe was now plunged into a war which would engulf the whole world in flames.